Most people assume that if a business is making real money, thousands of dollars a month, month after month, it has to look like a business. A storefront, a sign, delivery trucks pulling up outside, employees coming and going, something you'd notice. But in basements across the country, in the spare 400 square feet under an ordinary house, a different kind of business is quietly operating. No sign, no customers walking in, no delivery trucks, just a door at the top of the stairs that looks like every other basement door on the street, and on the other side of it, a system generating over $6,000 a month. This is the story of that basement. From the outside, nothing about this house looks different from any other house on the block. A modest single-story home, an attached garage, a yard that gets mowed on the usual schedule. If you walked past it, you'd have no reason to slow down. But underneath it, behind a door most visitors never open, 8 separate small-scale systems are running at once. Each one quiet, each one compact, and each one producing income that most people would assume requires a commercial building, a business license posted on a wall, or at minimum, a lot more space than a basement. What makes this operation work isn't one big idea. It's 8 small ones, layered together, each feeding off the other's waste, heat, humidity, or customer base. A crop that grows in the dark next to shelving that holds inventory for a completely different product. A workbench that produces goods sold to 3 different types of buyers who will never meet each other, and who have no idea the same basement supplies all 3. This documentary walks through each of those 8 systems, what it is, why it stays invisible, how much it earns on its own, and why, together, they add up to a basement quietly worth $6,500 a month. Whether you're interested in basement entrepreneurship, small space income, self-sufficiency, or simply curious how ordinary houses can hide extraordinary operations, here is what's actually happening below the floorboards. System 1. Gourmet mushroom cultivation. The first system doesn't need a single window. In fact, it works better without one. In one corner of the basement, a series of plastic-lined shelving units holds rows of white polypropylene bags, each one packed with a mixture of hardwood sawdust and soybean hulls, each one sprouting clusters of oyster mushrooms in shades of gray, pink, and pale yellow. This is a gourmet mushroom farm, and it's one of the most efficient small-space food businesses that exists, because unlike almost every other crop, mushrooms don't need light to grow. They need darkness, humidity, and consistent, moderate temperature. A basement provides all 3 for free. The economics are unusual. A single grow bag, seeded with mushroom spawn that costs a few dollars, can produce 1 to 2 pounds of mushrooms across 2 or 3 flushes over about 6 weeks. Oyster mushrooms sell to local restaurants and farmers market customers for anywhere between $8 and $14 a pound. Prices that would sound absurd for a grocery store button mushroom, but make complete sense once a chef tastes the difference between a mushroom picked that morning and one that traveled 1,000 miles in a truck. A basement operation running 40 to 60 active grow bags at a time, staggered so that some are fruiting while others are still colonizing, can realistically produce 40 to 60 pounds of mushrooms a month. At an average wholesale price of $10 a pound to restaurants, that's $400 to $600 a month from mushrooms alone, and the input costs are almost nothing. Spent substrate, once it's finished producing, doesn't even go to waste. It becomes premium compost, which sets up the next system in this basement perfectly. The reason nobody notices this operation is structural. There's no smell that carries upstairs when the humidity tent is sealed correctly, no visible plants near a window that a neighbor might spot, and delivery happens quietly. Usually the grower dropping off a cooler at a restaurant's back door before the morning rush, indistinguishable from any other small food delivery. Restaurants, for their part, rarely advertise where their specialty mushrooms come from. A menu might say locally sourced oyster mushrooms, and the local source is a house 11 minutes away with a basement that has never once been photographed for a business listing. System 2. Microgreens under grow lights. A few feet from the mushroom shelving, a completely different kind of system runs on a completely different principle, not darkness but precisely controlled light. Stacked wire racks hold shallow trays, each one lined with a thin layer of growing medium and blanketed in bright green or deep purple microleaves. Sunflower shoots, pea shoots, radish microgreens, and a red-veined amaranth that chefs use almost entirely for visual appeal on a plate. Above each rack, a bank of full-spectrum LED grow lights runs on a timer, mimicking daylight hours regardless of what the actual weather is doing outside. Microgreens are, pound for pound, one of the fastest turnaround crops that exists. Most varieties go from seed to harvest in 7 to 14 days. That short cycle means a single 4-tier rack, holding maybe 20 trays, can be harvested and reseeded roughly every 10 days, which means the same small footprint produces a new crop more than 24 times a year. The buyers are almost always the same type of customer who buys the mushrooms. Independent restaurants that want a visually striking garnish or salad base they can't get from a large produce distributor, plus a smaller number of direct-to-consumer subscription customers who pay a flat weekly fee for a rotating box of fresh greens. A modest 4-rack setup, sold at roughly $30 a pound wholesale and $40 a pound direct, can bring in $800 to $1,000 a month once the rotation is dialed in. What keeps this invisible is the same thing that makes it efficient. It's entirely indoors, entirely under artificial light, and produces no odor, no soil mess outside the growing trays, and no seasonal die-off that would require explaining a sudden gap in supply. The electric bill ticks up a little from the grow lights, but it's a fraction of what commercial greenhouse heating would cost, and it never shows up as a separate line item anyone questions. It just reads as a slightly higher monthly power bill for a house that, from the street, looks perfectly ordinary. System 3. Small batch soap and candle production. Move past the growing racks and the basement shifts character entirely. A folding table holds digital scales, silicone molds, and a small double boiler setup, the workstation for a small batch soap and candle operation that has nothing to do with agriculture and everything to do with craft. This is one of the oldest home business categories there is, and it persists for a simple reason. The barrier to entry is genuinely low, the margins are genuinely high, and the products genuinely don't need much space to make in volume. A batch of cold-processed soap, lye, oils, fragrance, and color can produce 20 to 30 bars from a single pour that takes under an hour of active work, plus a 4 to 6 week cure time that requires nothing but shelf space, which a basement has in abundance. Candles follow a similar logic. A single pot of melted soy wax, scented and poured into a dozen containers, takes less than 90 minutes start to finish, and once cooled and labeled, sells for $12 to $22 depending on size and scent complexity. What makes this system different from the mushrooms and microgreens is the sales channel. Instead of restaurants, this operation sells almost entirely through an online storefront and seasonal craft fairs. A basement producer running 2 or 3 soap batches and 1 or 2 candle batches a week, selling through a simple online shop and a handful of local markets, can realistically generate $1,200 to $1,800 a month. Some months higher around gift-giving seasons, some months lower. The reason this stays hidden from anyone who isn't specifically looking for it is packaging. The finished products look identical to anything sold at a boutique or a farmer's market table. A craft paper label, a ribbon, a small ingredient card, with no indication that they were poured on a folding table 8 feet below where a family watches television every evening. Customers who buy online never see the workspace at all. They see a product photo, a shipping label, and a small package that arrives a few days later. System 4. 3D printing on demand. In the far corner, away from the soap fumes and the mushroom humidity, sits a bank of 3 desktop 3D printers, each one running almost continuously, quietly extruding layer after layer of plastic filament into shapes that range from replacement parts for household appliances to custom tabletop gaming miniatures. 3D printing occupies a strange middle ground in the home business world. The equipment cost is real. A decent printer runs anywhere from $300 to $1,000. But once that cost is covered, the ongoing expenses are almost nothing beyond filament, electricity, and the printer's own maintenance. A single spool of filament, costing around $20, can produce dozens of small items depending on their size and complexity. The customer base for this kind of operation splits into a few distinct lanes. There are hobbyists who buy custom miniatures and tabletop accessories through online marketplaces. There are small businesses that need short runs of a specific plastic part, a bracket, a clip, a prototype, that would be wildly uneconomical to order from an overseas injection molding factory in quantities under 1,000 units. And there are individual customers who find a listing for a replacement part for an appliance that's no longer manufactured, and are willing to pay a premium simply because nobody else is making it anymore. Running 3 printers around the clock, a basement operator can realistically fulfill enough orders to bring in $900 to $1,400 a month, with almost no manual labor beyond loading a new print, removing a finished one, and packaging orders for shipment. The printers themselves make a faint, steady hum, closer to a computer fan than anything that would carry through a floor, and the plastic smell, while noticeable up close, doesn't travel far in a basement with even modest ventilation. This is, in many ways, the most purely passive of all 8 systems. Once a print job is queued, it runs unattended for hours, sometimes overnight, producing finished goods while the rest of the house sleeps. System 5. Worm castings and vermicomposting. Underneath the soap table, stacked in dark plastic bins with small ventilation holes, lives a business that most people would never guess is a business at all. A vermicomposting operation, quietly converting food scraps and spent mushroom substrate into one of the most sought-after soil amendments in gardening: worm castings. Red wiggler worms are almost absurdly efficient at what they do. A well-maintained bin, fed a steady diet of vegetable scraps, coffee grounds, and the spent substrate left over from the mushroom operation upstairs, or rather, downstairs since it's all the same basement, can process pounds of waste a week and convert it into a dark, crumbly, nutrient-dense material that gardeners and small nurseries buy at premium prices specifically because it outperforms standard compost for seed starting and container gardening. This is the clearest example in the entire basement of one system feeding another. The mushroom operation produces spent substrate that would otherwise be waste. The worm bins consume it and turn it into a second product entirely. Nothing here is purchased as an input beyond the worms themselves, which, once established, reproduce continuously and never need to be bought again. Worm castings sell by the bag, typically in 5 and 10 pound sizes, priced anywhere from $12 to $25 depending on the market. A basement running a modest bank of worm bins, nothing large, just 4 or 5 stacked totes, can produce enough finished castings to sell $300 to $500 a month through local garden centers and online listings, almost entirely as a byproduct of waste that would otherwise go in the trash. The reason this stays invisible is the least surprising of any system in this documentary. It's compost, kept in sealed bins, in a basement. There is no reason for anyone, a neighbor, a delivery driver, even most house guests, to ever know it exists. System 6. Custom leather goods. On the opposite wall, a heavy workbench holds cutting mats, edge bevelers, and coils of vegetable tan leather in shades of tan, chestnut, and black. The setup for a small custom leather goods operation producing wallets, belts, and small bags. Leatherwork sits at an interesting intersection of craft businesses. The materials are relatively expensive compared to soap or candles, but the finished products command correspondingly higher prices, and the customer base skews toward people specifically seeking handmade, long-lasting goods rather than mass-produced alternatives. A hand-stitched leather wallet using a few dollars worth of material and a few hours of labor routinely sells for $45 to $75. A custom belt, personalized with a name or initials stamped into the leather, sells for even more. This is a slower business than mushrooms or microgreens. There's no rapid turnover, no weekly harvest cycle, but the margins are wide enough that even modest volume adds up. A basement operator producing 8 to 12 finished pieces a month, sold through an online shop and word-of-mouth custom orders, can bring in $600 to $900 a month, with the flexibility to scale up during gift-buying seasons by simply working more evenings at the bench. What keeps this operation quiet is, again, almost entirely about presentation. Finished leather goods, professionally photographed and shipped in simple packaging, look indistinguishable from products made in a small studio storefront. Customers ordering online have no way of knowing whether their wallet was cut and stitched in a dedicated workshop or on a folding table 8 feet from a bank of humming 3D printers. System 7. Home recording and voiceover studio. Not every system in this basement produces a physical product. Behind a second, smaller door, one lined with acoustic foam panels and a heavy blanket for extra sound dampening, sits a compact home recording studio. A microphone, an audio interface, a couple of studio monitors, and just enough space for one person to sit and talk. This corner of the basement isn't selling mushrooms or leather goods. It's selling time and skill voiceover recording, podcast editing, and small audio production jobs booked entirely online through freelance marketplaces and referral. A basement with reasonable natural sound isolation, improved with a few $100s of acoustic foam, can produce studio-quality voice recordings that are functionally indistinguishable from a professional commercial studio charging 5 times as much for the same session. The pricing for this kind of work varies widely depending on the job. A short voiceover read might pay $50 to $150, while ongoing podcast editing contracts can pay several $100s a month per client on a recurring basis. A basement operator handling even 3 or 4 small clients a month, plus occasional one-off voiceover gigs, can realistically bring in $800 to $1,200 a month from this corner alone, with startup costs that, once the acoustic treatment is in place, are close to zero beyond the operator's own time. This is also, notably, the system in this basement that's the hardest for anyone to ever discover by accident. There's no smell, no visible product, no shipping boxes stacked by the door. Just a closed door, a red light that clicks on during a session, and a client on the other end of an internet connection who has no idea their podcast episode was recorded 12 feet underground. System 8. Screen printing small batch apparel. The final system in this basement lives closest to the stairs. A simple 4-color screen printing press, a heat gun, and shelves of blank t-shirts and hoodies waiting to become something else. Screen printing occupies a specific niche in the small batch apparel world. Too custom and low volume for a large contract printer to bother with, but too labor-intensive to do profitably at true one-off scale. The sweet spot is small runs. A dozen shirts for a local sports team, 50 hoodies for a small business's staff, a limited run of a design sold through an online store. A basement setup, running a manual 4-color press, can comfortably turn out 50 to 100 finished garments a week during an active order, without any of the industrial ventilation or space that a larger operation would need. Pricing on custom apparel runs anywhere from $15 to $35 a garment depending on complexity and order size, and even a modest, inconsistent flow of orders, a few local businesses, a handful of online customers, the occasional bulk order for an event, adds $400 to $600 a month to this basement's total, rounding out the full picture. None of these 8 systems on their own would make headlines. A few $100s a month from mushrooms. A few hundred more from microgreens. Soap, candles, 3D printed parts, worm castings, leather goods, voiceover work, a handful of custom shirts. Individually modest, but stacked together, sharing the same square footage, the same electricity bill, and in several cases literally feeding one growing system with the waste of another, they add up to something that looks nothing like a hobby and everything like a real, sustainable $6,500 a month. Running entirely below a house that, from the sidewalk, looks exactly like every other house on the street. Whether you're drawn to small space entrepreneurship, basement homesteading, self-sufficiency, or simply curious how much income can hide in plain sight underneath an ordinary home, this is the reality playing out in basements more often than most people ever suspect.